Obviously, there's stark differences between Hugo Chavez and Donald Trump, but you do see similarities in the way they target different sectors of the population. It's dividing the nation. And when you talk to people, Venezuelans who have studied our, let's say, democratic backsliding, one of the points that usually comes up is dividing the population. It's looking for an internal enemy.
It can't happen here in the United States, you may think, but it can. This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great change, when authoritarian rulers began to establish or abuse their power, or when old orders fell apart. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Today, I am delighted to be speaking to Parsifal D'Sola, who is from Venezuela, but now living in Madrid, in Spain. We first met working together on articles and podcasts about China's relationship with Latin America, which is one of Parsifal's areas of expertise. He's the founder and executive director of the Andres Bello Foundation China Latin America Research Center and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. In 2019, he served as a foreign policy advisor on China for the interim government of Venezuela's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We'll talk a little bit about China today, but our main focus is on Venezuela itself. Parsifal, welcome to Rhyming Chaos. It's great to be in touch with you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeremy. Happy to, be in touch.
And can you start by telling us a little bit about the interim government that you worked for in 2019?
Well, where to start? So the interim government, for those of you who are not familiar, came into being in 2019, a few months after Venezuela's rigged political election, where Nicolas Maduro, quote unquote, won the elections. And there was, without getting too much into detail, there's a constitutional backing for when there's a vacuum of power, which is what happened after there was a rigged election. And the head of the assembly, at that time, Juan Guaido, constitutionally becomes the interim president of the country and has to hold elections in the next 6 to 12 months. So that's more or less how it comes into being. But at the end of the day, the interim government was de jure government, while the de facto government was still Maduro's cabinet.
Let's go back, way back, and perhaps we can have a brief overview of recent Venezuelan history. Bearing in mind, as you noted, some of our listeners may not know too much about it. Maybe I can start by summarizing a couple of thousand years, and correct me if any of this is wrong. Indigenous peoples, including the Arawak and Carib people, for whom the Caribbean Sea is named, they inhabited Venezuela for thousands of years at least before European contact. Christopher Columbus landed in Venezuela during his third voyage in 1498, beginning the Spanish colonial period, which lasted until the early 1800s when the pan-continental revolutionary Simón Bolívar, nicknamed the Liberator, secured Venezuela's independence from Spain. That's usually dated to 1821, I think. And then in 1914, oil was discovered, and for much of the next century, Venezuela was one of South America's richest, most developed, and later most democratic countries. But when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, the country faced an economic crisis that eventually triggered unrest, as rising poverty, inequality, and corruption undermined confidence in the traditional political system. And then Hugo Chávez came along. Is that summary roughly right, Parsifal? And if it is, let's move on to Chávez and tell us who he is, how he came to power, and how he ruled.
No, that's a very good summary. I would only add a bit of a context about Chávez, because it is through this period that you just mentioned where, due to, on the one hand, collapse of oil prices, but also, which is, I'm sure this is going to be connected to potential lessons for the U.S., there was a sector of the populace that was increasingly not being paid attention to. And it is around this time in 1992 that Chávez was one of the military leaders that leads a coup. It fails, but he's given these, 5-minute national TV audience in order to give up. And it is from that moment on that Chavez, becomes part of Venezuela's overall political establishment. And he was the reasons why he led the coup where they clicked with this sector of the populace that hadn't been paying attention to, was increasingly impoverished because of a set of economic policies that were of opening up that were taking place throughout the 80s. So from that moment on, this was in 1992, Chavez, became this sort of political outlier that was seen as someone who clicked with the overall, population of the country, the so-called the people of Venezuela, and that's what he builds on to run a political campaign in 1998 that he runs for office and he wins overwhelmingly. I don't remember the exact figure, but it was over 60% of the population voted for him. And this sort of gave him this mandate to return Venezuela to that golden age of the 70s, the 60s and 70s, where, as you mentioned, Venezuela was this, beacon of development and economic prosperity of the times. So that is how he comes to power. The media, the private sector, he won over the academic establishment, and they all supported his political campaign. So this is important because Venezuela used to be or was the South American country with the longest and most stable and prosperous democratic long run. The difference is quite stark because all across the region, countries were not only having economic problems, but we saw a lot of military coups from decade to decade, guerrilla problems, drug trafficking problems. Venezuela was seen as this city on the hill of political and economic stability. So Chavez wanted to go back to that. Chavez, promised that a refounding of Venezuela, taking up the torch of Simón Bolívar, the new liberator of the Americas. 6 months in, everyone starts to resign. His ministers, his cabinet, the media start, turning against him. And it was very obvious 6 months to 12 months in that Chavez had a different political project in mind. Autocratic tendencies in his language, the new appointees that were coming in. And this sort of avalanches into 2002 when there's this huge national movement where even the oil sector went into strike and Chavez was basically obligated to resign. The official version of this is that there was a coup. Again, depending on the reading of you give the Venezuelan constitution, that's way too complicated. But point being that he was pushed out of power for less than 24 hours. The same general that took him out of office was the general that put him back in office because of basically political infighting. And from that moment on, let's just say he was very aware of who was on his side and who wasn't. And from 2002 onwards, you saw this intensification of the autocratization of the country.
Can we go back a little bit to the factors that led to his rise? That the sectors of the Venezuelan population that were increasingly poor and unhappy. What was the cause of that? I mean, aside from lower oil prices, was there corruption and mismanagement in the government, or what happened?
So, to summarize, I would say there are two very important factors. One is that Venezuela's economy, the so-called golden years of the 60s and 70s, the country's economy was pretty closed. You had price controls, a lot of government subsidies, but the government could afford it. There was this huge oil boom. The oil industry was nationalized, so even more money came into the country. And it was a very prosperous time, and the government made good use of this money. The whole, well, not the whole, but an important part of the country's infrastructure was constructed throughout these decades. Caracas was one of the first cities. You would have to fact check me here, but I think it's the first city in South America to have a subway, but a very modern one. So there was economic and political momentum, but it was sort of like we lived in fantasy land, because a lot of this was only possible because of government financial backing. That's on the one hand. On the other, there was increasing malfeasance within government. We had a strong media that was, pretty on top of this. So there was an increased social understanding that government was corrupt and that institutions were failing. This is on the one. On the other, because throughout the 80s, Venezuela was very much aligned with the United States, especially in economic policy. So there was this shock therapy approach to basically liberalize the Venezuelan economy in a span of very few years. That coincided with a drop in oil prices. So it was a cocktail for disaster. And this culminated with one military coup in 89 and the another one in 1992 where Chavez participated
and made his name, became famous. And of course, I suppose one should mention that he was a very charismatic speaker.
He was hugely charismatic. I met the guy. I was pretty young. I was, 15 years old. Just one of those figures that walks into a room and owns it. It was made you laugh. It was just, the kind of personality that people ascribe to Clinton in the U.S. It's just this guy that was, just making jokes and connecting with people. And, well, he was pretty intelligent and bright.
Preparing for this, I watched a video of him at the United Nations saying that he could still smell sulfur in the room because George Bush, it was the Iraq wartime, had spoken there the day before. And it was, very gripping.
Yeah, no, and he said it with a huge smile on his face, and it's a kind of mocking everyone in the UN Assembly.
Right. So, like Bill Clinton, but also like a certain currently serving American president, one might say.
Very much so.
So let's talk about what happened to Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. So following the oil strike in 2002, 2003 that I think you just mentioned, what did Chavez do to the company and what happened afterwards?
Before I answer, there's an important context here. So PDVSA, so it's Venezuelan Petroleum Company. Still, it's a Venezuela state-owned oil enterprise. Prior to Hugo Chavez, while PDVSA was not, let's say, the absolute number one, it was arguably the most important and powerful national oil company in the world outside the Middle East. So during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was one of the top 5 global oil companies, way ahead of many private and state-owned competitors like, Petrobras in Brazil or, Chevron and ExxonMobil. It had direct control of refining and sales in the U.S. market. At one point, Venezuela provided around 15% of the U.S.'s oil consumption. So it was a juggernaut. Why do I mention all of this? Because that is long gone. Long story short, because of a series of policies that increase executive control over the state-owned company, which, a small parenthesis here, even though it was state-owned, it pretty much in practice worked as a private company. It had a board of directors. It was pretty autonomous from the Venezuelan government. Chavez knew that this was, it was the most important national income. So little by little, especially after the 2002 oil strike, he completely revamped the company, fired all of the board of directors. Everyone that had decision power within the company was substituted by loyalists. Little by little, malfeasance started, spreading over the company. It started acting like a sort of this black box slash piggy bank for the Venezuelan state. And this coincided with another oil boom. So throughout the 2000s, it was manageable. There was huge corruption around PDVSA that later came back to bite the country in the ass. So it was a mix of corruption, of assigning people who weren't up to the task. These were military officials that had no idea how to run an oil company. And the civilians within the company didn't have the expertise, the professional background to run the company. Put that all together, and that company I described at the beginning, just year by year, ended up collapsing to the point that when Chavez took office in 1999, PDVSA produced around 3 million barrels per day. Nowadays, it doesn't even reach a million. And
Wow.
during the peak of the crisis, Venezuelan crisis 2016-17, it didn't even reach 500,000.
Wow. And what was his stated reason for purging the employees?
Well, on the rhetoric side, it was that, we have to give the oil back to the people. But on the practical side, it was little by little, due to very stringent currency controls. Venezuela has had I don't remember the year, but it was the early 2000s where the first time the government started implementing currency control. You couldn't, buy foreign currency. You had to go through government to acquire them. And this destroyed the private sector. Even though Venezuela has, for the past, 6-7 decades, been highly dependent on oil, after the currency controls, this really squished the private sector, and little by little it was just completely just destroyed. We went from, in the 90s on average, like 70% of our GDP came from oil. After the late 2000s, it's over 95%. Nowadays, who knows, even if more.
Because maybe the government statistics are not reliable. Is that what you're implying by who knows?
No, there aren't any statistics. Venezuela doesn't publish economic statistics since 2016, 17 tops. So we don't know. No one knows.
That's amazing. Does any of that strike you as rhyming a little bit with what's going on in the United States right now with Elon Musk's Doge and Trump firing all the federal workers?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of resonance. And I have a lot of friends, Venezuelan friends, that have been living in the U.S. for years, even decades.
I hope they aren't getting deported.
Well, a couple of them are in a tough situation at the moment, and they might be obligated to leave in the next couple of weeks.
Oh, gosh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I would say on the rhetoric side, there's a lot of similarities. It's seeing an American version of what this grandiose, big persona, I'm on top of the world and no one can challenge me kind of vibe. Because obviously, there's stark differences between Hugo Chavez and Donald Trump, but you do see similarities in the way they target different sectors of the population. It's dividing the nation. And, when you talk to Venezuelans who have studied our, let's say, democratic backsliding, one of the points that usually comes up is dividing the population. This was, it's looking for an internal enemy. And when that is not enough, you look for an external one and you kind of balance it out as time goes on. So one of the things, I'm always hopeful that one day Venezuela will be able to turn the page. But I think one of the most damaging legacies of Hugo Chavez is that Venezuela had always been this very, united population in terms of culture. We had regionalisms, of course, like any other country, but if you compare it with its neighboring Colombia or any other country in South America, Venezuelans were always perceived as this united people. And Chavez changed that. Right now, and I've seen, American friends that, their families have gone into these feuds just because of talking politics. And for me, it's inevitable not to think back to the early 2000s when you started seeing that friends that couldn't talk politics, or families that were divided and never talked to each other again. And this was something new. This had never happened in Venezuela's history. So that's where I say there are similarities and that
Right.
resonate with my own experience in Venezuela.
That makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, during this time beyond oil, which other nationalized sectors experienced declines?
So, well, Venezuela was always a net food exporter. Over 90% of Venezuela's consumption was Venezuela's production. Food production was domestic. Nowadays, again, I don't know, but it's the last statistics from the around 10 years ago. The tables have completely turned. Like over 90% of the food that Venezuela consumed came from exports. So agriculture completely destroyed for the currency controls because it was cheaper, because the foreign currency was subsidized. So it was cheaper to import than to produce domestically. That's one important reason. And the other is he nationalized the main food producers in the country. There were some large conglomerates that produced the basic basket of goods.
And they had been private companies.
They had been private companies that were always perceived as successes of Venezuelan entrepreneurship from precisely that golden era that I described earlier.
And so what did the government do in response to this situation where the agricultural sector collapsed?
That's the thing. No one really noticed because there was still food on the shelves because it was being imported. This completely blew in Venezuelans' faces around 2016 when money simply ran out. There was no more money to subsidize imports. And this is when the Venezuelan migration it skyrocketed around this period because food shelves were empty, supermarkets were closing all around.
People were literally hungry.
No, people were eating. I perfectly remember in 2016, something I had never seen in my life. Well-dressed people, even with suits, eating out of the garbage can in Caracas. This is well documented. People were going hungry.
So maybe this is a good time to sort of bring ourselves up a little bit closer to the present. So Chavez died of cancer, I believe, in 2013.
Yes.
And he was succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, who he had selected. Can you talk a little bit about Maduro and, how he has taken over the system that Chavez gave him?
So that was a complicated transition because even though he was handpicked by Chavez, he didn't have, let's say, the political backing within Chavez's inner circle, which he required in order to govern. So this took time, this took years. And eventually within the umbrella of what we call Chavismo, which is the Chavez movement, different power groups began to play out. And eventually, because they shared a common goal, staying in power. And this proved enough of a cohesive pressure to maintain them in power. But so that eventually evolves that to the point where Maduro controls foreign policy, controls the oil industry. Some of his cabinet members control key industries in the country. And then you have the military who are controlled by another figure who's called Diosdado Cabello. It's also a military strongman, very close to Chavez, but let's just say he has the arms. And without this arrangement that eventually played out, odds are the Maduro government would have fractured from the inside. And, well, who knows? We might be having a different conversation today. But nowadays, Maduro is far better off. We've come from 2 years now, almost 3, without oil sanctions, which were lifted by the Biden administration. Over 30% of the population left. Imagine if 100 million Americans left the country in a span of 5 years. That's what happened in Venezuela. Yeah, close to 30% of the population left between 2015 and 2020. So,
sorry to interrupt. What is the population of Venezuela?
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. The last census was in 2011, 2012, around that time. And we were around 31 to 32 million.
Right.
So right now, it's mostly people doing estimates that put the population around 25 million.
Right.
So a lot of people left. The economy shrank to levels of, decades ago. So from a social perspective, it's especially after, well, we can talk afterwards about the elections last year. They're pretty comfortable in power, to be honest. I always say that I hope my read on the situation is wrong. I wouldn't be happier, but to be honest, they're pretty, through strong rule, intimidation, well, all sorts of repression tactics, torture, people put in prison, you name it. So fear is their main weapon. Through all those tools, I don't see any potential fracture of the ruling coalition that we have nowadays.
So let's talk about that election then.
This was quite surprising to everyone, internationally speaking and domestically speaking. The leader of the Venezuelan opposition is Maria Corina Machado. So she was a congresswoman during the Chavez years, always been a very staunch opposition figure that after more than 15 years in that arena, she came out as the only figure that still had some, because she always kept her argument. She was making the same arguments today that she was making 15 years ago. She has been consistent. And one of I'd say, an important reason why Chavez was able to stay in power and afterward Maduro without blaming, the opposition. But it also has had to do with the fact that we have proven that Venezuela's opposition has always been fractured from the inside, and the government has been very intelligent at exacerbating those fractures, and through different sets of tactics, from bribes to just pressure on family members, gotten people either to shut them up or get them to go into exile. But there has been a lot of political infighting. So within all that came out Maria Corina Machado, and this should be like a Netflix series. It was amazing what they pulled off in last year without resources. This was a national social movement that surrounded Maria Corina, and she was able to, I would say, two things are fundamental here. One, to get the hopes up of the population that to go out and vote. This hadn't happened in over a decade. That's the first thing, because we've been disappointed so many times that people have become sort of apolitical, that they just want to get on with their lives, regardless of who is in power. There's apathy. So she was able to turn that tide. And the second that was amazing is the way that she used the government's own tools against them. Venezuela's elections are done electronically. It's a system that was, according to the government, according to Chavez when it was first instated, the best voting system in the world. And it was actually, regardless of the criticisms that I've received in the past, it was actually very secure. It was very hard to crack, basically to manipulate, because there were so many checks and balances in these machines, and that she used all the same protocols, but she created, it wasn't her alone. Obviously, there was a bunch of people involved, technicians, engineers, social leaders that trained people to use the machines. And the most important thing is that these machines are all connected to the Venezuela central electoral system. And they are not connected to the internet. So you cannot, hack your way into this. And once the voting stops, the machines print out the voting record. Not the names, obviously, but they say Maduro received X amount of votes, Maria Corina received X amounts of votes, and so on. She managed to get her hands on over 80% of these ballots that have a hash code that it's just simply not possible to crack. And around 6 p.m. on the election day, the National Electoral Commission shut down the website, shut down the transmission of machines because they knew that this was a landslide that was coming in. And they were seeing the same numbers that Maria Corina's team were seeing. And they just simply shut down the electoral system. And so over the next few days, they managed to get the original printouts of over 80% of the machines at a national level. And the government knows those numbers. They received those statistics as well. And being able to do that in the 6 months, the run up to the election, I lost count of how many of Maria Corina's inner circle went to jail or were pressured to leave the country. I'm talking about, 10, 15.
Just because they were supporting her.
Exactly, yeah. Her right-hand guy, then, well, this also has to do with, I didn't mention this, which is an important factor, that Maria Corina wasn't allowed to run. She was barred from running. So even though there was a primary election, which was pretty limited because this was in theory supposed to be sponsored by the government. Primaries are a legal requirement in Venezuela, and the money for the
And that's a party primary, similar to in the U.S.
More or less the same thing, exactly. So obviously the government wasn't going to fund a primary for the opposition, so she had to basically depend on volunteers and funding from outside Venezuela to hold a primary in the country. There was, again, a lot of pressure from the government. There were raids around the voting centers during the primary. But even so, these were like North Korean numbers. Like 99% of the people who went out and voted at the primary voted for Maria Corina. So she had...
When you say North Korean, but I mean, you're being facetious because they were real.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So it was insane. Like everyone voted for her, both inside and outside Venezuela. So that's part of that movement, getting people, getting their hopes up again that I mentioned.
But then she wasn't allowed to run.
She wasn't allowed to run. She was barred according to the government because she's been created a bunch of these bogus, how to call them? Well, legal claims against her that she's an anti-patriot, and the list is very long, but it's a replacement, which was her name was also Corina, and a long-standing, impeccable career academic woman, there was no way you could make something up against this person. But they just sit around. The government didn't allow her to register her candidacy. Suddenly, in the time frame that you have to register the candidacy of the people running for office, the system was down and no one was able to register. Well, Maria Corina had this ace, under her sleeve, and then Edmundo Gonzalez, who was the person that eventually ran, was seen as a palpable candidate by the Maduro government, a Venezuelan career diplomat who had been retired for a few years. He's in his early 70s. So I'm speculating here, but I think he was probably seen as a non-threatening actor that could legitimize the elections. So that's my read on why they allowed him to register his candidacy. And at this time, there were a bunch of negotiations between Maria Corina's team and the government. This was all around the time where there was U.S. Diplomatic, which was what eventually did happen, that they allowed elections, skewed elections, to take place because Biden lifted. So this was an important card. It didn't work at the end, but...
And why didn't it work? Because, I mean, I think at the beginning of this, you said that they did, in fact, win overwhelmingly. So what happened?
To this day, they haven't released the results. They published a number, which was, even for their standards, it's quite low. They published a round number. It was a perfectly round number percentage-wise. The amount of votes that, according to the government, Edmundo got and Maduro got. So the website, where for the past 20 years had always published the official numbers by voting table by district, by state,
Sort of
nationwide.
the way in the United States they've released the numbers by state. Yeah.
Exactly. And this was in July last year. The website's still down. So the official numbers never came out. And they just, Maduro came out and said, no, the head of the National Electoral Council, that's it. That's basically, that's basically what happened.
And this is what I think is going to happen in the next U.S. presidential election. And many of my American friends think I'm crazy.
Well, I can say I'm familiar with contemporary U.S. history, political history. There are a bunch of reasons to be alarmed and worried. That being said, the U.S. still has, they're being eroded. You still have, important checks and balances. You still have the media. You still have people who want to push for the truth, even if a sector of the population doesn't want to hear the facts. But again, what happened in Venezuela took years. This doesn't happen overnight so it's not that this started with a presidential inauguration in January. This dates back quite a few years, and I would say even before Trump. But that's the thing. I think this question you asked me for, the similarities. I mentioned the division of the population and creating us, you against us against them. But the other thing is about selecting people based on yes men and people qualified to actually do the work. That's a huge red flag. And the longer time goes on, the longer those institutions will start debilitating. I lived in Colombia for 5 years till last year when I moved to Spain. And we always had this, me and some Colombian colleagues, the conversation popped up. It's like, why has Colombia, despite its very traumatic history, especially in the second half of last century, drug trafficking, cartels, a lot of violence, but it still managed to avoid a strongman like Chavez, or Chavez is stereotypical. We have a bunch of those across Latin America. Chavez just happens to be one of the most successful ones and the most recent ones. But, 20th century is full of them. But Colombia managed to avoid them. Why? We could get into this whole different conversation here, but usually it has to do with the fact that despite all of its problems, Colombia has always been a very legalist and very prone to establishing strong institutions based on the rule of law. And if you break the law, even, depending on who you ask, but one of the most, let's just say, influential presidents in Colombia's history, which was Álvaro Uribe in the 2000s, was the person that declared the war on the cartels. He's been going He's been on trial for the past few years, and they're not letting him off the hook. And he's very popular. And still, the judicial system has stood strong, and they were able to indict him. And he's been, I don't know how many years now, under house arrest. So that speaks volumes in terms of the importance of institutions and rule of law. And they don't disappear overnight. It's little by little. And that's where I see a lot of the similarities. We thought we had stronger institutions. We didn't. We ignored an important sector of our population that was growing not only poorer, but also felt disenfranchised from the political establishment, that their voice weren't being heard. So all these points I'm mentioning, don't they ring a bell with what's going on in the U.S.?
Yes, they do. They do. Parsifal, let's switch to China. What has China's role or influence been on all of this? And go back as far back as you think is relevant.
You're talking about Venezuela in particular? Or
yes. Yeah, Venezuela.
So
the United States, a whole different can of worms, isn't it?
Yeah. But for me, it's been fascinating and depressing at the same time to study China-Venezuela relations for the past bit over 15 years now. As you know, I lived in China for 8 years. And so I've been obsessed with the China-Venezuela relations. And the arguments I always make, and I think that this is pretty much backed up by data, that Venezuela, there was this marriage, not of convenience, because that's usually how it's portrayed. Venezuela, largest oil reserves in the world. China needs oil, and it has a lot of, money to give out, loans. So that's what brought these countries together. That's way too simplistic. And when you start, looking at the whole picture, the high level meetings initially that started in the early 2000s, China joining the WTO. I think I probably mentioned this, and well, when Kaiser and you interviewed me a few years ago and on the Seneca podcast, that it was around this time that China was seeking further new markets, new allies. Latin America is the furthest region away from China. They've met little by little, as you will know, expanding their influence. The going out policy. This reached Africa and eventually reached Latin America in the early 2000s. And then this charismatic, this political juggernaut that was Chavez comes into the radar because of a meeting that high political figures, Chinese figures, met with Fidel Castro in La Habana in the early 2000s, and they talked about Chavez, and they talked about this new liberator of the Americas coming into power in Venezuela with oil riches. And that turned into a deep, intricate partnership between the Venezuelan state and the Chinese state. Why do I say this? Oil, it's an important part of it, but I think the most attractive factor of Chavez out of Venezuela at the time was that Chavez was actually leading a regional political movement that excluded the United States and sought to create an umbrella for countries like China, like Russia, closer relationship with African countries. It was, well, outside the global north. And if you look at Chavez's speeches across South America, in Sao Paulo, in Santiago de Chile, in Buenos Aires, in Lima, he always talked about China. They were going to inaugurate, I don't know, a bridge, and suddenly in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle, and he starts talking about China, that we have to deepen our relationship with China. He held a megaphone promoting closer relations with the PRC. And this was backed by petrodollars. Venezuela has always punched way above its political weight. And this is historic. Maybe we're too egocentric. I don't know. But, Venezuela led, I don't know how the initials in English, OPEC, the Organization of Political.
Yeah.
So that was a Venezuelan initiative. And Venezuela pushed against the United States back in the 70s and made it happen. And we've always been projecting our power regionally. And this was a different type of projection. 50 years ago, we did promote democratic values. So there was reason for disagreements with the United States, but there was a strong promotion. Venezuela was, I think at one point it even pressured the U.S. with oil shipments because the U.S. was promoting coups in Central America and in certain parts of South America. So it was a democratic stewardship of a country. 2000s, Hugo Chávez, it was the complete opposite. We started doing the complete opposite, using our petrodollars and our influence to basically promote political allies across the region. So obviously, if I'm sitting in Beijing, if I'm Hu Jintao, and I see this guy without any need for this, he was doing this, I'm sure he wasn't being paid or anything. He genuinely promoted China out of admiration for China. And well, obviously there's an interest, but at that time we didn't have any sort of loans or any close political engagement with China. This came after 2005, 2006. So obviously you have this guy in a region that you don't have any close relationships outside of Cuba, promoting your interests, putting money where her mouth is. And the best thing of all, he's promoting an economic and political bloc without the United States and inviting extra regional actors to participate. You handed it over to them on a silver platter, and it is after. Well, it happened simultaneously, but it's within this context that the huge oil for loans start taking place.
Wow, that is a fascinating history. I'm going to ask you one last question, Parsifal. What do you think Americans could learn from Venezuela if in this country we are to avoid a descent into strongman rule?
Well, first of all, I hope that never, ever happens in the United States or anywhere. But seeing your fellow Americans as the enemy. That's not only wrong. That's sad. That's really heartbreaking. And once you're in it, it's hard to take a step back and realize that you're contributing to break the social fabric of the United States, which has always been one of optimism, one of being proud, being proud of being in America, being proud of your history, regardless of the checkered history that the U.S. might have, but it's always aspirational. At the foundation, I've had the over the last 5 years, I've had the chance to engage with a lot of U.S. diplomatic corps and also government officials, including from the State Department and to some extent Congress as well. And it was always amazing to me how there was this sense that, yes, we might have screwed up here, we might have done this in our history, this and that, but you're always aspiring to do better. And that's it's kind of getting lost in this whole mess that the U.S. has descended upon over the last decade. So I think that's people could take a step back to actually look at what the political infighting is being done. And it's not about Donald Trump is not the problem. Donald Trump is a consequence. It's the same thing that I say with Chavez. Chavez came to power and was able to do what he did because we had a history that produced the figure of Hugo Chávez. And so it's not about blaming Trump. It's like, at the end of the day, he won an election. So a lot of people voted for him, understanding and it never has a perfect answer. There's a bunch of factors. They're economic, they're political, they're social. But it's when someone comes in like a bulldozer that you weren't expecting, it was because that person was able to see something that you did not. And most of the people that are appalled by what's going on and by Donald Trump's election, I think there's sometimes a disconnect. It's like you kind of blame the 50-something% of the population that voted for Trump. Again, people vote because they saw something in this. They might not have liked the whole package. It might have been voting against the Democrats. It's not about voting for Trump. So there's a lot of ways you can factor this, can explain it out, but it's never simple. And blaming people that voted for Trump for the current state is just simplistic and unrealistic. So understanding a little bit more what produced him, and this takes a lot of introspection, I would say, because Trump is going to be. This is the second term. I'm pretty positive that it's going to end there. Donald Trump, the man, but everything he started, it's still going to be there. Someone will pick up the torch. And this is something that the U.S. is going to have to deal with in the coming decades. This is not going to be solved with a new Democratic president in the coming elections. This is real, and whatever produced him came out into the light, and you're going to have to deal with it. And again, I think there's a lot of introspection to be had here.
On that note, thank you so much, Parsifal. That was so interesting, and interesting to learn about Venezuela just on its own. But I have to say there are a lot of quite terrifying resonances with the United States. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by U.S.A. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you again, Parsifal.
Oh, thank you, Jeremy.